So tonight I will be Tasmina. So I'm going to be chairing this, which is unusual for me. So just to reflect that Nicola Sturgeon has resigned, part of her resignation would have been down to the campaign that women have run against the self-ID. And it's really quite amazing, that Scotland seems to be a country that's managed to push back on self-ID. Maybe Scotland has peaked the world. You never know. But the fact that a politician has resigned and a lot of people are ascribing it to the fact that the self-ID got so much hostile reception by the Scottish people. That means that other politicians might think twice in other countries, hopefully, about it. But just to finish, as always said, Anna Sarwar shouldn't get away with this. Labour are in lockstep with the SNP, and the idea that he can capitalise or take advantage of SNP difficulties with this policy when Labour are as bad and Keir Starmer are as bad. And of course, Liberal Democrats are as bad and Greens are as bad. The politicians are all dreadful, so it's just lucky the people have more sense. So, all good news to start off with, I think, anyway, positive. Maybe the DRR bill is dead, maybe it won't be challenged. If it is, maybe they'll lose the challenge. But at least, there's a hope. There wasn't hope on the 22nd of December, but there's a lot of hope now. So we're going to start off this meeting and first introduce Yvonne Ridley, who is Alba Women's Convener and a journalist, very well-respected, well-known journalist, and has also very big supporter of Scottish independence since she moved to Scotland. So I'll hand you over to Yvonne.
Thank you for coming this evening. I mean, obviously this is all hooked up on Charlie Abel's campaign, and I'm sure everybody in here has done their bit to help him. But it's so important to keep on going with the same enthusiasm and vigour, because we have to get Charlie elected. And I was here last weekend and I was blown away literally by the spot that he's chosen on the roundabout. Was it the A69? To put his stall, but great spot, that's for sure. Anyway, I'm rambling on because I've lost my speech. It suddenly disappeared from the screen. So I know it's here somewhere.
So while Yvonne looks for her speech, I will take over to give her a little bit of breathing space. And what I'd like to speak about just for a minute is we have a very good friend and a woman that would not wished, one of the women that would not wished, and she came to many of our demos, and she would have loved to be with us tonight. But unfortunately, she's been taken to she's in hospital tonight, so can't come. And it's Trish McPherson. So I think we should all say a big thank you, Trish, for all your efforts for women, and get well soon. So now I'll pass back to Yvonne, who I can see has found her speech.
Sorry about that. Well, what a week this has been for women. The best of everything and the worst of everything seems to have converged. We sort of got a hint when Sky News alerted us all that Nicola Sturgeon was going to give a press conference from Bute House at 11 in the morning. And there was quite a bit of foreshadowing of her departure in the wake of the failed GRR bill. And so at 11 a.m, the drama of Nicola Sturgeon's leadership began to unravel before our very eyes, while she turned her resignation speech into the longest farewell. I mean, my goodness, it went on, and I was waiting, you know, for the, that's it, I was waiting for the tear to be squeezed out at just at the right time, and I was dying to go to the loo, and in the end I gave way and went off to the loo. When I came back, Sky had split the screen because there was another press conference which people had been waiting to hear, and that was for another Nicola, and this was Lancashire Police updating us on the nearing 3-week now disappearance of Nicola Bulley. I don't know if you've been keeping up with it, but it's the woman who went missing when she was out walking her dog. I mean, shamefully, I must admit that I wasn't that emotionally invested in the Nicola Bulley story, but I lost the remote control and so had to listen to the Lancashire Police Conference, waiting for them to go back to Edinburgh with an update on Nicola Sturgeon's resignation. But within minutes, I started to take notice because it was obvious the police were using Nicola Bulley as a human shield to protect their own incompetence. And I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing unfold. This was unprecedented victim blaming in order to try and protect the reputation of Lancashire Police. They alluded to her vulnerability in front of all of the media, and in the end the press conference raised more questions than it answered. So what was this vulnerability, and why were we hearing about this for the very first time? Within a few hours it became clear Nicola Bulley, a mortgage advisor, we were told, had been struggling with the menopause and alcohol. I mean, what the hell has going through the menopause got to do with Nicola Bulley going missing? The police are supposed to find a missing woman, not smear her reputation as an alcoholic who will likely be blamed for her own disappearance and therefore written off. Medical experts say we women go through the menopause at the average age of 51. Although it can begin anywhere between 40 and 58. But during this period, our bodies go through major hormonal changes, and in the early stages, triggering hot flushes, night sweats, mood swings, among other symptoms. We have seen the disgusting way the police have treated women in recent years, but this was a new low. I mean, I was still reeling from the Sarah Everard murder in London, who was killed at the hands of one of the Metropolitan Police's own. And the brutal treatment of women by police who turned up to disrupt her peaceful vigil. I don't know if you can remember that, where police had knocked a woman to the ground, and I think about 4 of them were involved in her arrest. If, as we all hope, Nicola Bulley is found alive, I'm not sure how the police will justify the breach of her confidentiality and how it looks to the outside world. The police have come up with this disclosure to manage their own reputation, and it's obscene. And you might be thinking now, well, yeah, but what's this got to do with Nicola Sturgeon going? It's just how establishment groups manipulate the media and cast the victim as the perpetrator. And we've seen this happening in Nicola's farewell speech, which I think Wings of Scotland said. She said about 50 I's and me's, and mentioned the SNP a couple of times, but it was all about her. But going back to the police conference, even the dreadful Suella Cruella Braverman, as I call her, had intervened and is demanding questions of Lancashire Police. The briefing earlier in the day revealed that Nicola Bulley's long-term partner, Paul Ansell, had told them of a number of specific vulnerabilities that caused them to treat her disappearance as high risk. And I mean, it's great to see so many women here tonight, and I genuinely do believe in the sisterhood. And to listen to Detective Superintendent Rebecca Smith throw the victim under a bus to save her own reputation, there's something particularly nasty when a woman does that, when she betrays her own. And I felt that here is a woman in a position of authority who has done exactly that. And unfortunately, we can draw parallels with what is happening in Bute House today, where women who won't wished have been thrown under a bus. I guess that most of you in here today are very much against the GRR bill, but we have been told that our views and our opinions are not valid. And that coming from Nicola Sturgeon, who reckons she's a feminist to her fingertips, well, I don't know a single woman who's managed to upset that many women, that many strong, influential women as she has. It was brutal to turn round and say, these views aren't valid. And of course, and I'm sure that Eva will go into this more, but we've seen what it's led to, the consequences and the reactions to the GRR bill. But it was interesting to see the way that the police managed to single out and demonise this one poor woman who's gone missing. And quite frankly, if she'd had enough and she'd just gone away for a few days, she's less likely to return now. That people have been told, oh, well, she's an alcoholic going through the menopause. And, you know, what her hormones and her alcohol intake have to do with her going missing? Absolutely nothing. But the police have flagged this up, showing absolutely no respect for her privacy. But isn't it amazing how all the conventional rules go out of the window when it comes to the authorities closing ranks? And we've seen that with the SNP. You know, it's in their constitution that the election of a First Minister will take 4 months to until they find the right candidate. But now we're being told that the right candidate will be found in less than 4 weeks. And one of the first things that they will be expected to do is to resurrect the GRR bill and continue the fight. Where the sense in all of that is, I really don't know. And my frustration isn't just with the leadership of the SNP, which quite frankly is just doing what it wants. My issue are with the ordinary members who are allowing them to get away with this. And I think that quite a few of the Alba membership come from the SNP, and I don't know how it was for you, but when the scales dropped off my eyes, it was very much an overnight thing, and I just had to get out as quickly as I could. So we're in very, very difficult times. I mean, politically, this is no time to be homeless. And what I would say to people in the SNP is wake up, smell the coffee and come and join Alba. because the one thing that we are unwavering about and single-minded about is independence. And I have met women who have said, look, I'm more concerned with the GRR bill. Let me get this out of the way and then I'll think about independence. But it's all interlinked. The GRR bill would never have got this far in an independent Scotland. It never would have been allowed to happen. And everything that we do, every complaint that you hear on the doorstep while you're campaigning for Charlie, it actually all links back to independence. Our leader, Alex Salmond, was up here just a week or so ago, and he knocked on one door and a woman was there wearing a hat and a coat in her home because she couldn't afford to put the heating on. That wouldn't happen in an independent Scotland. Kenny McCaskill, one of our MPs in Westminster, has been doing some number crunching about gigawatts and megawatts, and it was actually over my head, despite him explaining it in very simple terms. But reading between the lines, we're being skanked by Westminster. They're taking all of Scotland's natural resources and energy and squandering it. And our bills are the highest in the UK. Well, that can't be right. And it wouldn't happen under an independent Scotland. So it all comes back to independence. So that is why Alba is, it is fighting for women, but the priority is independence. But we've got to, women are under attack. And can I say to the men in here tonight, thank you so much for coming here and thank you for your support, because we do need it, and I think they do deserve a round of applause. But we're living in perilous times where our views are not considered valid. And for the First Minister, a feminist to her fingertips, to tell the world that our views aren't valid. We've seen the result. A woman goes missing, it's her fault. A woman's murdered by a man, it's her fault. A woman gets raped, it's all her fault. It's the clothes she wore or she brought it on herself. And in Scotland, if we have a woman going to the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, daring to ask to be examined by a female doctor, the rape victim ends up being called a bigot and told to leave. That isn't, I don't recognise this Scotland that has been created by Nicola Sturgeon. And just because she's resigned, it doesn't mean to say that things are going to change overnight and there's going to be rainbows and pots of gold, because there isn't. The same toxic, cancerous cabal that controlled Nicola Sturgeon is still in Holyrood and controlling Holyrood. And Denise is right when she talks about Anas Sarwar. I know that he does not like the GRR bill, and if he had a spine, he would actually stand up and say, dump it, drop it. But he won't, because he will take anybody's votes at any cost. He has no principles. And so to think that, well, I'm not going to vote SNP, you can't look towards Labour for a solution either. They've been disastrous in Scotland once. You can't reheat a souffle or reheat toast. It's not going to work. So don't think about going back to them again. And I could go through, there's the Tories. well, you know, even with a gun to my head, I don't think I'd be able to put a cross down for the Tories. We're going to be facing some tough choices when the elections do come. But the easiest question when they come knocking on your door for your vote, the easiest question to ask is, can a woman have a penis? And that'll sort the wheat from the chaff. Because if they can't answer a simple question like that, how on earth can you trust them to answer anything else? And it's the very question that brought Nicola Sturgeon down. She won't admit it, but that is what did for her in the end. She refused to turn round and say that this double rapist who was sent to court and Vale, she refused to identify him as a man or a woman. And as I said before, Nicola Pett, if it's got a penis, it's a man. Simple. Anyway, I don't want to go on and make this speech as long as hers, otherwise you'll all be asleep. But just finally, all I would say is that the misogyny at play in the trans community, and it is a very misogynistic community, could never have got a foothold in Scotland without handmaidens like Nicola Sturgeon and Lorna Slater. They've even ensured this toxic legacy will continue. Last night, Mike Russell said the next leader of the party would carry on the battle over the GRR bill. How much that is going to cost, I have no idea. But the indecent haste with which the SNP is ready to anoint their next cult leader is there for all to see. And as I say, these are tough times, but we have to get the message out that women won't wish, that Alba is the party for women, and that also Alba is the party for anyone who wants equality, cares about human rights, the environment, and, you know, please do whatever you can to help Charlie get elected. And, you know, let's start this month with a victory for Alba. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yvonne. So another good thing that happened, actually, as well as the Prime Minister fingerships resigning due to GRA issues, is that the Sandyford Clinic is not taking any more referrals, which is excellent. So I'm very, very chuffed about that. So there's been a couple of things of good news, and we just have to at least there's hope now. There's hope for somebody, and hope for the end of GRR and self-ID, hopefully. So we go to our next speaker, who is Eva Comrie, who's the Alba Equalities convener. And of course, these you're kind of in the presence of stars, because Eva and Yvonne, you might know that you see most Sundays on the Prism show, giving their opinions. So Eva's, she can introduce herself, I think, but she's she's a lawyer, and so like knows the law, so she'll be able to tell you more. So Eva,
thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Women's rights matter because since time immemorial, women have been abused, battered, ridiculed, exploited, raped, murdered because of our biological sex. That's sex, not gender. And that is the start and the finish. of what we need to know about gender recognition or gender recognition reform. And it's a lesson that's been hard won by some politicians who wouldn't bloody well listen while they're listening now. So, those politicians, though, who thought that they might on the world stage have something to say that might have been worth hearing, were very good at talking about the rights of women and girls in, for example, Malawi, where they argued for single-sex toilets in schools. Or they argued in various parts of the world, including in the UK, for laws against the awful practice of FGM, where we had some of our politicians travelling worldwide to argue against child marriage in some eastern countries as well as in some states of the USA. But these women, in the main, forgot about the women and the girls in Scotland who deserved their attention and whose needs and views were more valid than those around the rest of the world. So we have an Equality Act where sex is a protected characteristic and gender reassignment is a protected characteristic. Gender identity and gender are not protected characteristics for very good reasons. So tonight's event in part was entitled GRRB, is it dead? Where do we go now? Is it past? Is it stalled? Is it stunted? What's going on? Nobody knows. And the reason why nobody knows is because obviously the first feminist has decided not to resign because she's not done it yet, but she's going to be doing it. She's staying in the job until her successor is appointed. And as Yvonne has already said, and I think Denise might have alluded to, the SNP have decided to alter their arrangements whereby a new leader would be elected. And the effect of that is that the new leader of that party, and probably also the new First Minister, will be in place before the deadline by which time the Scottish Government is obliged to apply to the court for an order to challenge Westminster Section 35, because the deadline's the middle of April. Is it the 17th of April, Denise? So in normal circumstances, Nicola Sturgeon would still be the leader and still the First Minister when that deadline comes about. But because they've gerrymandered their own rules yet again, somebody else will be in the frame and will have to take the decision as to whether or not to go to court. Now, it is abundantly clear, you'll see this daily on Twitter from the likes of Roddy Dunlop, King's Counsel, Joanna Cherry, King's Counsel, and an awful lot of lawyers, a hell of a lot smarter than me, that the prospects of the Scottish Government winning that case are practically zero. It will cost a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot more heartache than there has already been, and it's a continual, constant deflection from the job in hand, which was supposed to be independence. So I don't pretend to know what goes on inside the brains of some of these folk. I do have a concern that many of them were over-promoted and underqualified, and I think that's perfectly obvious when you look at the fact that there is no immediate obvious successor to the First Minister by design, quite deliberately. But my concern for the women and the girls of Scotland is that regarding only gender recognition reform takes us down a road where we become isolated and we might not be open to the implications of practices elsewhere that have occurred since long before the GRRB, which is obviously not in force, was first invented. So if you cast your mind back to the beginning, the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, in its preamble, I like to read this to get it right, because one day some smart nurse is going to tell me that I'm wrong, and I'm not. The Gender Recognition Act of 2004 says, now remember this is a UK Act, this is an act to make provision for and in connection with change of gender. Gender, not sex. So the first 8 sections of that act explain what the process is, and I think everybody here will know it's a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, followed by 2 years living in your acquired gender, then you apply for your certificate. Contrary to reports from people that think they're smart, you don't go in front of a board, you fill out some forms and you produce your medical evidence, and then you do or you don't get your certificate. The new process would obviously do away with the medicalisation, and the period of 2 years would be reduced to 3 months. But that's to get you a certificate, which you then use in terms of Section 9 of the Act to re-register your birth in effect. You get a new birth certificate. But nobody in the UK has ever had a birth certificate that narrates their gender. You've got a certificate that changes your gender, but you take it to the registrar, who gives you a birth certificate which has altered your sex. So if the Westminster government in 2004 had been honest, they'd have said, this isn't a Gender Recognition Act that we're producing, it's actually a Sex Change Act. But they didn't do it then because it's ridiculous. They knew it then, they recognised it then, and the only way they could get it done was by calling it change of gender. But the point of that, and the whole purpose of it, was that it was recognised internationally that the UK was slightly behind the times in not enabling people who were transgender to get married, because they were going to be getting married to somebody that they thought was the same sex as them, and in those days we didn't have same-sex marriage, which now, of course, we do. So because we now have same-sex marriage, some people would say there's now no longer any need for any gender recognition certificate. But that's an argument for another day. So we've got the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, which lets you change the sex on your birth certificate, and it has a restricted use thereafter. Separately, we've got the Equality Act of 2010, where there are 9 protected characteristics. We know that one of those is sex. We know that gender reassignment is another. But where we've got poor practice in Scotland arises from what I would call a deliberate manipulation and a deliberate misinterpretation and a deliberate education of people by Stonewall and the like, who have tried to say, and in many occasions have successfully got people hoodwinked into believing, that if you claim the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, you are automatically entitled to be treated as the opposite sex. And the result of that has been, long before the Gender Recognition Reform Bill was introduced, which we stress is not yet law, the effect of this process of authorising self-identification was seen obviously most starkly in prisons, but it's in operation in hospitals, and as the result of the transgender guidance for schools, it is also in operation in nursery, primary, secondary schools, in colleges and universities, and none of it is legal. None of it, not one bit of it. But the interesting aspect is that the Scottish Government's practice, especially under Nicola Sturgeon, has been to create some limited legislation, but then implement policies throughout various different aspects of public life by way of guidance which does not have a legal or statutory effect. That's seen most clearly in the transgender guidance for schools. It's guidance written by the Scottish Government with the assistance of the usual suspects. It's issued to all schools except private schools, and it's up to individual local authorities whether or not those schools implement the guidance. But if the guidance is implemented and a parent, say me, objects, then I don't get to sue the Scottish Government. My beef is with the local authority of the school that my child attends. That's where Nicola Sturgeon and her cohorts were flying. So, in effect, you can see they paint the schools into a corner because they give them the guidance. We're expecting you to implement this, but it didn't come greeting to us when it goes wrong. Something similar is going on within hospitals. When I'm in hospital, it's usually Glasgow. And to my absolute horror, a couple of years ago, I found and read the Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board transgender guidance. It is still online. It's been amended a couple of times, but the amendment was actually to remove more or less one line, which referred to people who didn't like people of the opposite sex in their wards as being transphobic. It doesn't say that anymore. What it says instead is that if you're a hospital inpatient in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, you are allowed and ought to be and have the right to be treated as the gender into which you identify. This has got nothing to do with the GRI bill. This has got nothing to do with gender recognition certificates. It's got nothing to do with changing your birth certificate. It's self-identification. I don't know when it was introduced in Glasgow, but I know that the first set of guidance was created in 2011, if not earlier. So what the guidance says is you're housed in the ward or you're accommodated in the ward of the gender into which you identify, which will create issues, obviously, for medical staff if you're a trans-identifying man with a prostate who wants to be in a women's ward, or you're a trans-identifying female with a hysterectomy who wants to be in a man's ward, but let the medics worry about that. But if you are a female in a female ward and you see a male patient and you say to a nurse, can I have a word with you? There's a guy in here. The guidance, and it's still sitting there, you can read it tonight if you want, the guidance says that the nurse has to say to the patient, this is a female ward and only female patients are treated here. So if the female patient says, that's a man and this is a women's ward and I didn't want a man in here, the advice is that the female objecting has to be told again, this is a female ward, there are no male patients in here. And if the difficulty continues, it is the female patient who is the one who has to be removed. That's the guidance from Glasgow, but if you check what all the other health boards, you will see that they all either have or have now hidden exactly the same advice because it comes from the same original source. And the original source, of course, are the same people that wrote the guidance for the Scottish Prison Service. Now that began to be written probably in 2014, 15, 16, that's all a little bit hazy. But at that time, when it began to be written, what was evident, most people here will know this, is that the Scottish Trans Alliance assisted in its creation. And what they said was that if we could, I think the word they actually used was strategise, we strategised that if we were able to encourage the prison authorities to accommodate trans-identifying males, that's trans women, in the female prison estate, that would make it easier to incorporate that policy right across the board in all public services. And of course, we've seen that unfold. So, in relation to prisons then, there's been a gender issue for very many years. It is not a recent development. And the First Minister knows this, Keith Brown knows this, everybody in the Scottish Government knows this, because they've been told about it often enough. They've promised to review the guidance. They have been contacted by Women in Here, I'm sure, but all the different organisations for several years now have repeatedly complained about this. You've all seen and heard Kate Coleman, and you've definitely seen and heard Rona Hotchkiss. They have been talking loudly and long about this for a long, long time. This did not happen with Adam Graham or Andrew Burns or any of the other nutcases that you read about. It certainly didn't start with Katie Dolotowski. But in the real world, what we've got is a set of circumstances where the Scottish Prison Service guidance says there will be a risk assessment of a patient of a prisoner who claims to be transgender, but the risk assessment at times treats the prisoner in the gender into which they have identified, so that a trans-identifying male could be risk assessed as a female. And there have been circumstances where those risk assessments have tended not to take into account the impact or the risks for others, including other prisoners and staff. So none of that's new, but it's been an evolving process and it's been in place for a long, long time. What's interesting for me is if you try to kind of figure out, knowing that we'll never ever, or the truth has not yet seen the light of day, shall we say, why is it that Adam Graham was on trial for, was that a fortnight? And the press and the telly and the BBC and everybody else, his lawyer, I think the clerk of court, the judge, all referred to Adam Graham as either Dyson, and he was she throughout the entire process. When this Adam Graham was convicted, the warrant authorising his removal to prison said he was to go to Berlin. And it said he was to go to Berlin because oddly enough it was recognised that he's a man. So Barlinnie was the nearest male prison to the High Court in Glasgow where he was on trial. So I knew that because I was told that by somebody who knew this to be the case. But I know other people who got the same information from other kindly sources. So we also knew that when Adam Graham was in the prison transport, literally en route to Barlinnie, somebody made a phone call. And there was a diversion to Cornton Vale. Now, you've seen the Lessons Learned review, or you've seen the abbreviated version of the letters about the Learned Lessons review, where the Chief Executive Officer of the Prison Service actually confirmed, yeah, that's right, it was Barlinnie, but SPS decided Cornton Vale was the appropriate place. I want to know who changed the warrant. Who said, no, he's not going to Barlinnie, he's going to Cornton Vale. And I'll tell you what I think, and I might be wrong, and for those watching, this is my opinion, which I'm entitled to hold. And it's not unlawful to hold it, and it's not defamatory to hold it either. My opinion is that at the end of this couple of weeks, where this person had been on trial as a female, with she, her pronouns, there was no chance that the Scottish Government could agree to she, her going to Barlinnie, because then people would have been saying, when are trans women, not women? So to keep up appearances, it wasn't the Scottish Prison Service. They couldn't care less where the prisoner went. They probably didn't want the prisoner in Cornton Vale, as we think probably transpired. The only people with something to gain by saying this prisoner went to Cornton Vale were those in favour of the GRR bill. Because although it had nothing to do with the bill, and it was Scottish Prison Service guidance that might allow him to be in Cornton Vale, how stupid. With Nicola Sturgeon, Shona Robson, Lorna Slater, Maggie Chapman, Patrick Harvey, how stupid were they going to look if all of a sudden the front page news on the Record or the Sun or the Telegraph or whatever it was, trans woman sent by Nicola Sturgeon's prison service to a male jail. That on its own was going to blow wide open the entire gender reform process, and rightly so. So what did we have instead? Their face-saving exercise, because somebody decided this, was this convicted double rapist man was going to go to Cornton Vale, a women's prison, because despite the fact he's a convicted male rapist, he's actually a woman, because he says he is. So somebody somewhere decided that the female prison officers and the female prisoners in Cornton Vale were going to be the subject of an experiment to see just how much the public of Scotland would put up with. That's what that was about. What else could it have been? There is no other sensible and remotely intelligent way to decipher all of that. So, think back to the spectacle that we had. You had the furore of the trial, you then had the ridiculous carry-on about where was he and why was he there. Oh, it's no us, it's the Scottish Prison Service, we can't interfere. It's up to them. Trans women are women. And then we had a new category invented, obviously. We had male, female, and did we have rapist first? And then we had male, female, rapist, and then individual. So I don't know what you call them, if you call them sexes or genders, or if you just say that they're sneaky buggers that know their numbers up. So in the midst of that, though, what we also had, and again this was not new, was that we had the other fellow, Andrew Burns, who apparently his transfer to a female establishment was authorised but put on hold, because all of a sudden it was possible to put these things on hold when they'd never been on hold before. This is the guy that couldn't go on trial in Alba Sheriff Court because he was such a danger, and his trial had to be collapsed and held elsewhere. One of his nice wee hobbies is to bite holes in his own veins to spray blood at people. But he was deemed appropriate and safe enough to go to a women's prison. That was him. We know about Katie Dolotowski because he was in Cornton Vale in November last year. The First Minister and the Justice Secretary weren't jumping up and down about that. Katie Dolotowski, registered sex offender, having attacked, sexually assaulted 2 young children under the age of 16, and subsequently, when on remand in Pullman male establishment, battered a guy in there on the back of his head. That led to further charges. Katie Dolitovsky got out of jail after serving a sentence in relation to sexual assaults, went and lived back home, and then was on probation and hopped it down to Leeds, which was a breach of his probation. And while he was in Leeds, we know where he stayed, in a women's aid refuge. 6'5" man in a women's aid refuge for 6-7 weeks. Came back up to Scotland and was done for having absconded without permission from the address that in effect was his probation address. So he's in court for that, he's in court for the trial for the assault from Pullman, and he's remanded in custody, 6'5", fully intact, male, remanded to Cornwall for 3 weeks. And while he's in Cornwall, obviously women won't wish to have their campaign, their protest outside. I was there. Obviously they get permission from the Scottish Prison Service to have the protest. It's filmed, it's on Twitter, it's on all sorts of social media. There's a lot of publicity about it. The local MP and MSP knows about it. What do? Hee-haw. So what's the difference between Katie Dolitovsky being there in November and this Adam, whatever his name is, Adam Graham, double rapist, this year, or Andrew Burns, Tiffany Scott this year? Who knows what the difference is? It's just all of a sudden somebody somewhere has realised there's something really stupid about all of this and very, very dangerous. But naturally you think, is there something in here that's been happening recently that might help to explain why the First Minister chose this week for her announcement? And the cynic, which you have to be these days, might suggest that it has something to do with the butcher. The butcher. Now, in terms of the guidance that we had for Adam Graham, who was a trans woman and woman, and then he was a rapist, and then he was an individual, nothing like that happened with the butcher. Because if you'll remember, the rumours were that the butcher was a trans woman, and then suddenly all the reports were a man. And it's all the way through, it's a man, it's a man, it's a man. So obviously he's had another court appearance today. One would like to think he will remain remanded in a male prison while justice takes its course. But the other interesting piece of news today, and this is literally hot off the press, so I don't know the entire information about it, is the trans-identifying male who's been in the female estate for several years. And I think it was yesterday in Cornwall, he, fully intact male, was on the phone and he was overheard by other inmates boasting about his convictions, which are sex offences against children. That had not previously been known to the female inmates, and he's now been moved. So I don't know, because I don't think anybody knows, how many males remain in female jails. But the importance of that is none of this is affected by the GRR bill. So if it's in its death throes and it's no coming back, we still need something done about transgender guidance for prisons, and transgender guidance for hospitals, and transgender guidance for schools. Because in the context of schools, I'm sure you all know that the guidance says that children are entitled to use the facilities of the gender into which they identify. But in Scotland, and don't ever let any councillor or politician tell you otherwise, in Scotland, girls are entitled to their own single-sex toilets where sex means biological sex. So schools that have what they call gender-neutral toilets are breaking the law. And sooner or later, somebody's going to take them to court for it. If there's to be a crowdfund or whatever for that kind of thing, that would be fantastic, because that's what's needed. So we know boys can go into girls' toilets, boys can go into girls' changing rooms, boys can use girls' showers. That's not being hysterical. That is what the transgender guidance says. But from my perspective as a practicing lawyer, and I deal mainly with family and child issues, The other serious problem for me with the transgender guidance is it says that if you as a teacher have a child who confides in you that they consider themselves to be transgender and they don't want you to tell anybody, then you as a teacher are authorised by the guidance and required by the guidance to keep that secret. When I started work in 1980, we were just beginning to learn about safeguarding and grooming, and the number one red flag was keeping secrets. So that on its own, I'm actually getting goosebumps there because it just drives me round the bend. So all of that stuff's got to be revisited, no matter what happens with gender reform. And none of that is to say that there's an issue about trans people. There is no issue about trans people as far as I am concerned as a person or my political party. The difficulty is balancing human rights and safeguarding and respect and understanding that biological sex matters very much, not because all men are predators, but because some men are, and those predators who are will, as we have seen over and over again, especially in the last few months, they will exploit every loophole to the absolute maximum of their ability. That's just life. So rather than opening the door and letting the fox into the hen coop, I think we need a bit more protection for the chickens.
That's Eva. I think the thing is, it's bad for... The GRR debate has actually made life very hard for genuine trans people, because now they're just associated with these predators. And when they had the diagnosis, I spoke to somebody, I have a friend who's a trans woman, trans-identified man, and she went through the process. And what happens is they weed out the people that are there, just the predators, the men with fetishes. They weed them out and they don't get the GRC. It's only the people with gender dysphoria that get it. So, but without that now, the trouble is that group, that umbrella that used to just have the small number of people with gender dysphoria who actually needed certain treatments and help to deal with their gender dysphoria, and they could be accommodated. That group is now under this umbrella that includes men with fetishes, basically, as well as predators. So the butcher is a transvestite, is a cross-dresser. But a cross-dresser is under this umbrella that it shouldn't be. So I think it's Nick Sturgeon and all the Be Kind mob. They've actually harmed the people that they think they were being kind to. They've really harmed them. So that's a very, very sad thing for trans-identifying people. So now we're going to go to questions. So if people have a question, Charlie, do we have a mic take about, or will oh, great, Charlie, who is our candidate and also sound person with our cameraman, Gavin. Charlie will bring you the mic. So anybody that wants to ask a question, if you just put your hand up or let Charlie know. There's a lady there, Charlie.
You might find this a strange question, but I might be dumb. Can someone actually tell me, what do men, or self-ID men, when they go into hospital, what ops are they actually going for, and why are they sharing a women's ward? Are they in the same ward as women with the same ops? I can't get my head around that.
I can't either. If you read the guidance, all that the guidance says is that the patient, and it doesn't say male or female, it just says the patient. All patients are entitled to be accommodated in the ward of the gender into which they self-identify. So I know it sounds ridiculous, but there is, as far as I can see, no division in management, depending whether you're there for something that's related to your reproductive system or, breast operations or whatever. And I think that a lot of that must be terribly difficult for people who are genuinely trans. But we're not allowed to say genuinely trans because obviously the language and the atmosphere that's been fostered in the last few years is that we're supposed to say if somebody says they're trans, they're trans. But you'll remember that there's been quite a few issues where people have said, one politician in fact had commented about a relative of his who was trans and who died because this person was born or was female but lived their life as if they were male, and they died from, I think it was cervical cancer, because they didn't go for cervical smears out of embarrassment because they were living as a man. So there are lots of things like that that really need to be considered properly. But the way to not do it is, I think, the way that in many respects Scotland has actually done it, by offending people as opposed to actually thinking genuinely about what needs there really are and what rights and checks and balances there should be. So whether you were talking about hospitals or prisons, I think I'd be tending to the view that there should be a proper process of debate and discussion about expectations and about decency and about rights, which would probably include wards that have single rooms so that people keep their dignity and people who are trans don't get upset and don't upset other people. And the same with prisons, because we'll be polite about it. If trans-identifying males went to a prison for trans-identifying males, there might not be so many of them. But if trans-identifying males think they're getting to go to a women's prison, suddenly there's an increase in the numbers. So distinguish between medical needs and other needs. Medical needs should be properly and totally and completely respected, but I think that that's probably where a lot more privacy is required, so that there are individual facilities available, so that you've not got folk that are reluctant to go for treatment that they need because they are embarrassed or they are hurt, and other people that are embarrassed or hurt because they don't want to be in the company of others that are the opposite sex. So it's not straightforward, but the way to correct it is, I think, to talk about it a bit more sensibly than has been done so far.
So, a question that's kind of in two parts. It's to do with the wording after the Adam Graham case sort of came to light. The first one being that men with the convictions for sexual assault on women would not be allowed into women's prisons. I took that to mean that if a man was decided he was a woman but had been charged with fraud, he might end up in a women's prison.
Then you might be right.
But with the low prosecutions on men for sexual assaults and rapes, how can you say that a guy who's in for fraud isn't also a rapist or someone who's going to sexually assault a woman? And the second part was with the wording in the GRR. Again, it just sort of picked up the wording in some of the reports, was that they would go to the prison of their birth sex. If the GRR allows you to change your birth certificate, is there any way you can then stop a trans-identifying man who has a GRC that says he was born a woman? Can you stop them going into a women's prison?
If there's a vacancy for justice, minister, you should get it. The review or the letters that have been released about the recent review refer to the changes requiring temporarily that the prisoner goes to the prison of his birth gender. The letter says birth gender, it doesn't say birth sex, so yes, you're onto something there. Because obviously you're not supposed to be able to disclose or required to disclose that you've changed your gender. So there is an issue there, but there's an enormous problem in the first part of your question about the nature of the conviction might enable you still, as a male, to be transferred to a female prison. I know this from my own professional experience as well as the experience of many others, because for the first few years most of my work was done, and most of my work involved acting for women that were in women's aid refuges, and more often than not, far more often than not, they didn't even go to the police, let alone anybody be charged, let alone anybody be convicted, and that's never improved. So the chances are, I would say, very, very high that a guy in jail for assaulting his pal or, theft or road traffic offences or whatever, a lot of these guys will have already offended against women but never been done for that. And that's not to say that, as I said before, I'm not saying all men are predators, I'm just saying if you're going to look after women, then keep women's jails for biological women, and the men can go to men's jails, and if there are men that aren't safe in there because they say they're trans, they can go somewhere else. So.
The Italians do have prisons full trans people. So, it's been tried and tested, so it's, why nobody has thought of that. But,
because it doesn't validate the men.
That's right.
It doesn't validate the men.
Well, yeah.
Do you know if the numbers are as high in a country like Italy, with the amount of men identifying as well?
How many Italians?
Yeah, if they have separate prisons that they go to, are the numbers,
Well,
percentage-wise, this?
I was just reading about it a couple of days ago, and they referred to them as boutique prisons because they're quite small, and presumably that's because there's just a very small minority of men who identify as women.
I think it's
Is it not California?
that you indicated that if men who identify as women go to a separate prison, there might not be as many of them that will identify because they're not getting into the place where they're being validated. I've often wondered, I don't know the history of this in any way, but the history of developing people who wish to identify in this point of validation, has it never been offered that if you wanted to change your birth certificate or whatever it is to this legal, that there is some mechanism, particularly in relation to health, where you keep your birth sex, but you then have your gender changed? Because from a health point of view, it's a complete and utter minefield.
Yeah. Your gender isn't recorded anywhere, so there's nothing to alter.
But for that, look at the amount of, I've noticed it in just kind of random things that I've been filling in over the last year or so. It's gender that's asked.
But they mean sex.
You do mean sex. So why is there not
Don't mean
some
sex.
place?
Excuse me, but they don't mean sex. That's a deliberate policy.
But no, what I mean is for paperwork, is there not some?
There is
some fight for us to have that if we are putting any sort of paperwork out, that we have both sex and gender.
That assumes everyone has a gender.
There's a different problem with that, though.
Or you choose sex and not applicable.
You could do that, however, you have to rewind a few years to when the Scottish Government must have taken a decision behind the scenes that we didn't know about and started a mission creep where everything slowly altered. So I think the first time I noticed it was applying for a disclosure certificate renewal. So because I work with children and families, I have an enhanced disclosure, and you have to apply through an online form, and the application form asks for your gender. So obviously I went off like a rocket. It was being applied for through Stirling Council, so I got on to them and said, I'm not filling this out. This isn't just ridiculous from my perspective, it's positively dangerous across the board. You should not be asking for gender in a disclosure. because a lot of these certificates are for people like me that do background reports about children, where often sheriffs or children's panels want to be able to identify the sex of the person who's doing the report. Because I might be interviewing a wee girl because her stepfather abused her, and so they want the girl to be interviewed by a woman, not a man. So I had this argument with Stirling Council, who had to get on to the Scottish Government. They got the standard email reply that says it's your gender, and if you don't fill out the form, you can't get a certificate. So if you kind of scroll down and go to another page, you can say don't want to say. And the interesting thing about that is when you then go on to look at other government websites and Scottish Government job application forums, they all ask you for your gender. But I thought I was smart because the Scottish Legal Aid Board website asks you only for sex. So I thought, well, I can say to the Scottish Government, why have you not changed that? I didn't look far enough into it because the website's just been changed. So when you apply for legal aid, and I'm sitting in my office and putting it online, page 1, name and date of birth and what have you. Page 2, national insurance number, and it asks you for your sex. Male, female, didn't want to say, aye, all right. And then as you go further on through the form, and you fill out the rest of it, there's then a page that comes up that tells you what you've already completed. And it doesn't say sex and then whatever it is, it says gender. So the question they asked was, what is your client's sex? But the answer that's recorded is gender. So naturally there was a tweet done. There's never been a reply, because I don't think they even know themselves that they've done that. But the new forum has all the equality and diversity questions on it, have you got a learning disability, were you in care, what's your ethnicity, all this sort of thing. But the statistics will be completely meaningless in relation to sex and gender because they've asked the wrong question and they're recording the wrong information. So when you say, for say health purposes, could you not record or have the option to record both? You could, but they've clearly ruled that out and they want to do everything by gender. Like, you know how you talk about violence against women and girls, or you talk about the sex pay gap, that's all changed and that's become gendered violence, gendered discrimination, gendered pay gap. So there's a lot of work to be done.
There's only about 400 women in prison, and most of them shouldn't be there. Yeah. Would it not be better to try and keep the women out of prison?
But that has been attempted because there are probably fewer women in prison now than there traditionally have been. If you kind of take away some of the extras that are there as the result of the pandemic and backlogs.
There's not very many men in prison as well.
There's thousands of men in prison.
Yeah, 7,000 out of a population of 5.4.
It's a lot higher than it should be.
And half of them shouldn't be there as well.
That's right.
And there's people with additional needs, and they're 50% of the prison population, and they shouldn't be there either.
I completely agree with you. Totally agree.
And as well as that, where women get abused, it's in their own homes. That's where they get abused. And they don't get legal aid. Ones who cohabit don't get hardly any legal aid available. You need to be a pauper before you get legal aid. And as well as that, the ones that cohabit don't have equal rights with other women. So if they want to get anything, they've got to put in a claim within a year, which costs thousands of pounds of legal fees, and then they're supposed to get a third. But they don't have equal rights with other women.
I don't know where you're getting your information about legal aid
I know where I'm getting it from several lawyers who cost thousands of pounds.
There are differences between spouses and cohabitees in certain respects, but not in terms of eligibility for legal aid.
In a claim within a year.
That's right, but that's under
review
review now.
And that costs thousands of pounds. You can't get legal aid. It's ridiculous, and as women are abused in their own home,
It's not.
that's where they're abused.
It's not.
And they can't get away because they can't get legal aid, and they've got to put in claims that cost thousands of pounds.
It's not that you can't get legal aid. The difficulty, please. The difficulty is that there are not enough lawyers still doing legal aid work.
Yeah.
Legal aid is available.
Yeah.
I do some legal aid work. I don't do as much as I used to do because it doesn't pay.
Yeah.
And the Scottish Government know that it doesn't pay.
Yeah.
And this is something that they've been told about often enough, and they're not listening because they think
charge
it's...
£450 an hour.
Oh, well, I don't charge that.
That's the going rate.
Well, that's the highest I've ever heard.
Oh no, that's the general rate.
450.
450.
Well,
That's a fact.
if you were doing a case on legal aid, in the very broadest of terms, you would get maybe, I'm going to say £50 to £70 an hour. But
But you pay back in any case. If you get a settlement, it gets paid back.
But there's some work that you don't get paid for at all on legal aid, and that's why lawyers are reluctant to do it, because nobody wants to work for nothing. But there's, the legal aid thing's a whole different ballgame. Sorry?
Lawyers and partnerships are making millions.
All right, okay. I'll apply for a job there.
Yeah.
Nice question. When and why did the SNP sell their soul to Stonewall?
I don't know when they did it. Do you know? Too long.
When and why did they sell their soul to Stonewall, the SNP?
Well, it would have been in that 15, 16 time frame, I would think, because that's when this guidance was all written.
Yeah.
And the
It's
reason...
earlier than that, because Scottish Trans Alliance wrote the
prisons.
prison thing
Yeah.
the year before.
Yeah.
So I think it goes way back.
Yeah, maybe, so maybe 10, the last decade, so starting around about a decade ago. But the why is, think a little bit easier. It's just stupidity. That's it. Because it looked like easy virtue signalling. And it ended up not just easy virtue signalling, right? They didn't look into it in depth. They thought it was another civil rights thing, like gay rights or something, so they never looked into it. And they just thought, this is great, we get more brownie points. And Sturgeon is very, very into brownie points and looking good and being, the chief mammy and whatever she calls herself. But what then happened is she built a political, a power base with the people that were gender ideologues that had been sold this, the youngsters in the universities that were getting sold. That became her power base. And so she ended up, she'd made all these promises to her power base that she had to deliver. And then ultimately, as we saw over the last month or so, crashed and burned. So I think it's because of stupidity and not actually looking into it in detail. Because nobody that actually... And then stubbornness of no matter what she was told by Murray Blackthorne Mackenzie or for Women in Scotland. I mean, Murray Blackthorne Mackenzie could have written the Alistair Jack's decision, like why he was stopping the bill. They could have written it. They told Sturgeon they had all these problems, but she would never take advice. She'll never vary. She had the personality that's probably that whole imposter syndrome she talks about. But she's so lacking in belief in her, herself that she's scared. If anybody would question her, she's very defensive. So she won't change. She wouldn't bend. She wouldn't listen to advice. She just was on this track, and she would refuse to go off it until she had a great moment in the Scottish Parliament on the 22nd of December, where they were applauding, people like that kind of violent internet troll Beth someone, in the gallery, while women like Marion from Fairview, Scotland, and Ash Reagan were crying. You must have looked at that and thought, where's the right side of history here? Because I don't think it's with those internet violent trolls in the gallery. It looks like these genuine, heartbroken women crying because they know the consequences of women. And thank goodness, thank goodness she's paid a price for it. But it's just that, it's a tragedy. Somebody just stupid and stubborn.
I think a lot has to do with legacy as well, because she was following on from Alex Salmond. Now, when I moved up here, it was 2011, and there was talk of independence. And I think there was only 6 Westminster MPs. But suddenly there was a referendum on the go. And when I moved up here, I was amazed at the benefits of living in Scotland, because you had a really progressive government, free university education, free prescriptions, the promise of better childcare, better pensions before the WASPy thing kicked in. And it really seemed to be a government that was going places, really progressive. 2014 came and Alex stepped down. And Sturgeon had a hell of a footsteps to follow into, really. And I think when I first met her, she was full of the fact that she had the only gender-balanced cabinet in the world. And she did, and she was right. And it was quite inspiring. And I think that she probably saw herself continuing this legacy. Of course, Cameron got lots of brownie points when he introduced the single-sex marriages.
But go to that, because Alex Salmond introduced single-sex marriage in Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, he did it completely differently from her, in that he brought everybody together. Now, the churches and the faith groups were against single-sex marriage, but he got them together, and he didn't tell the churches and the faith groups that, initially they were against. They all came round, they all agreed with it. When same-sex marriage went through, the majority of Scotland was for it. But Alex Salmond never said to anyone that was initially against same-sex marriage, "You're a homophobe." He never told anybody that was against same-sex marriage that they were bigots. He never set his dogs, or whatever they're called, the internet troll boys, abuse any woman that stood up for the right. He never set any of his team on anybody. He just got them round a table, addressed their concerns, then they were all happy enough, and when it went through, there was no, it was accepted, and it was the way to do it, the opposite way that Sturgeon did it.
And so I think she was wanting to create a really progressive government that the whole world would look and go, wow, this is what happens, if a woman's in charge. And she's probably put our cause back immeasurably, but I think that was her problem. And of course the Greens came along, and the Greens in Scotland are not the cuddly Greens that we've got in England. These lot are really almost fascist. Almost fascist in their determination to get this GRR bill through. And they're the ones that are sitting on the shoulder of the SNP at the moment and pushing them. It's a mess.
Can I ask the panel, probably Eva, if you look at this, which has been really a relentless attack on women's rights, does this not just highlight the need for a proper written constitution that takes the tinkering of things as important as this, and it takes it away out of the hands of politicians, that are enthralled to the latest fashionable thinking or captured with the latest anti-intellectual groups like Stonewall? I mean, surely I would think as Alba, we should have this should be one of the things we lead with in any campaign, a constitution that enshrines rights unless they're only changed by a proper national referendum.
The policy is that there should be a written constitution, and that rights should be enshrined in terms for women and men in terms of your biological sex. And I don't think that there's very many people who disagree with that, and it gives you a guaranteed position that politicians are not able to tinker with. But there are other issues that militate against that, and I think wrongly. And part of that is the lady's question about sex and gender on your medical records. You've seen in the last few years this drive towards people being allowed to say that they are who they say they are. So you need to be careful when you're writing that constitution to show that you are talking about biological sex and that everybody understands what biological sex means and that it is immutable and that it can't be changed. Because what I was reading there just now about sex and gender on your medical records is this argument that some people have where they think you actually can change your biological sex. So yes, a written constitution is vital, but so is education and general understanding that you can all live however you want to live, but we shouldn't be forced to believe something that is patently not true. But yes, written constitution absolutely goes without saying almost.
Can I chip in here supplementary to that? We're talking about this recording of your gender, certainly in the public sector. How does that affect your PSED requirements and their duties there? Does Westminster then, because they're reporting under the Equality Act, but they're only recording gender potentially and not sex, the requirement under PSED is to report your stats sex, because you're working to. But if you are not recording someone's sex, how can you report that?
Or you're recording sex wrongly, because you're recording
you're
sex that the person has self-identified as. So probably it's wrong as it is, like the census or whatever.
Setting up for Westminster to come for us again and say, actually, you're not doing this right. Yeah.
And pay, like they have to report, like on women's pay and men's pay. But if a load of men suddenly, for example, Glasgow could have saved themselves a fortune if only they persuaded all those guys to identify as women.
That's what John said.
Exactly.
Using comparators that are transgender.
I've never heard anybody say trans women or waspy women. It's an odd one.
I read something that just piqued my interest. It might have come from the MBM site, and I'm not sure if it's correct, but they said that the fee, I think it was the UK fee, for applying for a gender reassignment certificate was £140, and they dropped it to £5, which wouldn't even cover your administration costs. And then they said the number of people applying doubled.
It's mad.
What's the fee? What would have been the fee in Scotland?
I think it was 140 in Scotland because it's the same rate.
So why did the UK do that?
But that's what Scotland's. What?
Wasn't it? I thought it was the UK that had done it.
Yeah.
No, Scotland
dropped it from 140 to 5.
Yes.
What?
Yes.
Why?
That's in the GRR's bill. I think it's been paused with everything else, I imagine, at the moment. But basically, 3 months and £5 and you're a woman.
And the other thing I never understood was that they pulled a Section 35 on the bill before Isla Bryson was incarcerated. So the bill was pulled. How was she ever sent, she, to Compton Vale in the first place?
Because it's got nothing to do with the bill, you see, because since probably last century, there have been trans-identifying males in female jails. But if you only look back, say, the last maybe 25 years, all of that time there have been trans-identifying males in female jails because they've self-identified. And it's not lawful, it's never been lawful. But it became trendy, if you like, since the Scottish Trans Alliance wrote the SPS policy, which authorised it to happen because it said gender reassignment is a protected characteristic, forgetting that if you promote the gender reassigned person who has just chosen to reassign but hasn't done it yet, if you promote their rights, you've lost the balance that there should be across the board because you've forgotten to promote the single-sex rights of the females who are entitled not to have inhumane punishment by serving a prison sentence in the company of male prisoners. So sometime, somewhere, a female prisoner will make a claim. I hope they do.
Yeah.
But it's probably because they know that these claims can be made that the Scottish Government, the Scottish Prison Service were digging in their heels against it. Because there's a lot of women that have been in jail with men that thought they had to put up with it. I mean, the guy that's just been moved this week from Corrington Vale, the news report about him says the women were all right about it. The women weren't all right about it. But female prisoners can't complain about male prisoners being in beside them because they get put on report. So the GRR bill's got nothing to do with Ivor Bryson except that it makes everything a lot more obvious.
And can they have their prison sentence extended if they put on report?
Oh yeah. You lose privilege. Because remember, to serve half your sentence. So maybe if this has happened to a lot of women already. Rona Hotchkiss speaks about it really eloquently, and it's very sad. But if you say you're sentenced to 4 years and you have to serve 2 years, in practical terms, what can happen is you maybe serve 18 months, and at the end of the 18 months, you might start getting out on a bit of leave now and again, or out on a tag, and at the end of half your sentence, you're out. But if you get into bother prior to then, you'll lose some of these outside visits. You'll maybe not get out on a tag so soon or at all, and you might serve longer than your half sentence.
The important thing about the GRR is Lady Haldane's judgment. So just before Christmas, and this is partly the reason why Alistair Jack did invoke the Section 35. So where it does relate to Ivor Bryson, or Adam, the rapist, is that Lady Haldane said, and the Scottish Government argued in court, that any male with a gender recognition certificate was female, legally female. Female for all legal purposes.
But wasn't that under the 2004 Act? But he doesn't have
no, sorry.
He doesn't have a
No, hold on. Yes, it's a gender recognition certificate under the 2004 Act. The GRR that the Scottish Government passed makes no difference to that certificate. It's exactly the same certificate. There's no difference. It's the people that are able to get that certificate. There's no gatekeeping. And that's our problem. There's no gatekeeping, it's self-identification is the problem. It's not the certificate itself, it's self-identification. So any man pays £5, waits 3 months and gets the certificate. That's our problem without gatekeeping. It's self-identification. Now, what it means is a man who is a predator, a rapist, will be able to get that certificate. If Adam had got that certificate, if GRR had passed, Adam had the certificate, it would be hard. Nobody knows if he could have been stopped going to a female prison, because Lady Haldane says he is female for all legal purposes.
Yeah.
And that would be the problem, will be the problem if GRR ever passes, because it would be very, very difficult to stop predatory men. And there'll be a lot of them with GRCs.
The other unjust thing is, and Eva will probably be able to shed more light on this. A couple of years ago, I had a hip replacement, and somebody said you should be able to get a disabled badge. And I went to apply for a disabled badge, and I had a form to fill in that was, you needed an engineering degree to be able to just get through it. And I just gave up by about the second or the third page because the questions were just ridiculous. And of course, this was just for a temporary card that would allow me to park closer to the shops or wherever I needed to be. And I just thought, with this Gender Recognition Act, £5 there, you pay that, and you are in that gender for life. Nobody comes to check up a few months later, are you still living in...
Oh yeah, you have the reflective 3-month period where you can't... Who checks that?
Well, the snub checks over the next 2 or 3 years. in fact, there's just no checks. You've got this certificate for life. And I just thought, you know, for all the disabled people who have, I don't know how much you have to pay.
£20 every 3 years.
£20 to fill out this form. And as I say, you need a degree of some sort to be able to get through it. But it's, the authorities come and check up on you constantly, from my understanding, that you're still disabled, that you still need this certificate. And I just thought, well, that is really unjust, and you know, it shouldn't be happening in a fair and equal society, and that's something that I think that we should look into. I don't know if you want to add on to it more, Eva.
I think it just shows that the pet project was gender stuff as opposed to other people that might be equally deserving. But on your point about the Lady Haldane judgment, it's really important to remember that that judgment was in relation to gender representation on public boards. And the point is that the law said that if you were having a public board, a public body of any description, you should have 50-50 male and female representation. And that was because these boards were predominantly, literally, manned by men. So we wanted to have women on these boards. That's why we had 50-50 quotas. And of course now, as a result of the Haldane judgment, which says a man is a woman, these boards could be 100% male. That's how ridiculous that judgment is. But she was actually right, because the 2004 Act says, for all purposes, if you've got a GRC. Well, as Denise says, the issue is, how do you get a GRC? You got it in the past if you had gender dysphoria. Under the GRRB, you didn't need anything to get it. You just need your 3 months. So what I was looking forward to was, if the bill had been passed, you know, if it had got the Royal Assent, if it had not been stopped, whose spot, female spot, was Merido Wadwa getting on on a public board? Or when there was going to be a women's health SAR appointed, was that actually going to be a woman that was getting that woman's job, or was it going to be like the period guy down the road?
I'm interested in what all three of you, what your view would be. The 2004 Act came about, I think, because Goodwin, who'd gone full surgery, sued the UK government in the European Court. Would you have a different view about trans people who had undergone full surgery in prisons or in the female estate?
No, because you can't change your sex. Doesn't matter what you do, you can't change your sex. So a male body is a male body is a male body, even if you've had whatever surgery and you're taking whatever medication. You will always have advantages. But there's a psychological side to this as well, because women who have been abused, whether, at any time in their life, who don't want to be around men and don't want to be around men unexpectedly. You know perfectly well, you've got an instinct, you've got a sixth sense. It doesn't matter if the person standing in front of you is dressed in female clothes, with high heels and lipstick. He doesn't have to look like Eddie Izzard, but somebody who is biologically male but dresses and passes as female, women know damn fine are male. So women who don't want males around them can be triggered and re-traumatised by the presence of males, albeit that they might be nice, decent, law-abiding, perfectly nice folk. But women didn't want to be around them because it makes them feel bad. I respect that, and for that reason and that reason alone, I would say biological sex every time.
When you talk about the boutique prisons in Italy, have they had a gender reform act in Italy? Yeah.
I really don't know. Did they have a...
Well, the trans, I looked up the boutique prison, the one that seems to have had the most publicity, has got 30 inmates in it. So,
without the gender reform act, no.
I was reading a transcript recently from the discredited Mermaids charity, which has received thousands from the Scottish Government. We've essentially been funding the Mermaids charity, and one of the experts giving evidence for mermaids said you can't determine a baby's sex at birth. Now, and this was an expert. She said that you could only determine a baby's sex by checking the chromosomes first. Well, I don't know any maternity ward that does that before they say you've got a boy, you've got a girl.
You know it before, did you get the scan?
Folk Semple was the famous one. He was the only person, I think. He was
but this is what we're up against, experts who,
you've got XXY and XXX.
No.
Oh, that's right. She actually said that in an interview. I wouldn't know if I was a man or a woman if I hadn't checked my chromosomes.
Given the fact that the reason for the GRE
an
in the
MSP.
first place no longer exists, and given that, humans cannot change sex, and also given the absolute burdock that has been created, why not repeal the GRE? Yes. Because it's based on a lie. It is not a human right to be recognised as something you are not.
That's why I think a citizens' assembly is a good idea, because my personal view is the same as yours. But I respect that there are some people who quite genuinely will want to say something about their gender being different from their sex. So I think we need something in there for that, as well as safeguards.
But I'm sure, most people here and beyond, I, over the years, have become far less kind and far less willing to compromise. And I'm now at the position where I will not compromise an iota. If they gave an inch, they demanded it. They married it. I want that inch back.
I do think it's a bit of no good deed goes unpunished in this situation. I do think the Citizens' Assembly is a good way to go, to see what was the actual objection in the first place, and that needed to be changed, because that's not entirely clear what exactly was wrong or dehumanising with that process.
I've spoken to people who've been through the process, and they seem to be as against,
yes,
as
very much
against self-ID.
Sorry, Charlie. Yeah, the people who I've met, probably most of us who have been through the current process, they are as vehemently opposed to self-ID as women are. So if the people who have been through the current process are saying no, who is this supposed to represent? Who is going to benefit?
I mean, one of the problems for me is it came from above. This is not a civil rights movement. This is not a grassroots.
Oh, this is top down.
It was imposed by the United Nations, it appears to be.
Big tech and big pharma.
Yeah, but it came down because all the countries seem to start to do it at roughly the same time. So it's a top-down thing that's been.
Martine Rothblatt and Jennifer Pritzker.
Can I say, though, that something that really upsets me about a lot of this is that the women in the Scottish Parliament in particular who were so vociferously in favour of this are the women that in the main will not be affected by the implications of it, because they're not likely to be in a hospital ward with a man, they're not likely to be in a women's age refuge with a man, they're not likely to be at a rape crisis service and be told to park the bigotry at the door. So I think that even if we do get into a situation where we have a citizens' assembly, what's going to be so hugely important there is to make sure that women of all types, of all backgrounds, of all interests, abilities, interests, everybody is involved, so that we don't end up in the same situation again where we've got a lot of women who are detached from the real lives of most of the women of Scotland dictate what the law should be in their eyes, as opposed to what the general public who will be living it want it to be.
I mean, when you talk about the most marginalised and community and vulnerable community, I can't think of a more marginalised and vulnerable community than women prisoners. I mean, really, is there? I don't think so. And
there's women in care homes, there's old women in care homes, and you don't know what's happening to them because you don't know what's looking after them if you've got men that are allowed to identify as women and provide physical and intimate care.
And also, disabled children. I mean, our friend Alan Petrie has a very disabled granddaughter, and he's terrified for her. What could happen to her. So there's all these vulnerable groups that are put at risk by this policy, and they just have the cheek, the women in the parliament have the cheek to stand there and somehow make out their paragons of virtues because they're speaking for some marginalised community that's up in the gallery. They all went into the male toilet, the female toilets, and they're not marginalised. They're having selfies with the First Minister and the leaders of parties.
They're having speeches on video devoted to them, that our concerns are not valid and these things don't happen. Well, these things do happen. I come from Jedburgh, and we've got a little girl that's been raped by the transgender butcher. It does happen.
Disconnect as well with Sturgeon's belief that she's some paragon for their experienced children, which professionally, when I was a social worker, she was spouting this stuff first. She spoke about it again in her resignation speech. And they are the children, they have the mothers who are most likely to be harmed by these predatory men. Yes. And I just think if she joined up her thinking here, she would have realised that she was looking kind of stupid, really. And I think as well, when she spoke about the double rapist going into prison and no woman was harmed, I think it was something you said about women knowing that he was coming into their space, that he could have been coming into their space. It must have been terrifying. It must have been absolutely terrifying to think that that was likely to happen, that a predator, another predator, was coming into their personal space.
I mean, we heard from the woman, I can't remember her name unfortunately, but she had been in prison and she was saying she had a coil fitted because she was terrified that she'd be raped. And it's like, that's what we're putting these women through.
That sounds like mental torture.
Of course it is. But I think that's what the problem though is, that policymakers and lawmakers either think they know what's going on, or they're listening to lobbyists, or they're listening to civil servant advisors who in the main don't understand I suppose real life, whether it's for somebody who's in a care home or has somebody who does need care, or a prisoner, or I spoke to a couple of prisoners, but I also spoke to the sister of a prisoner who was worried sick, and her fears were that her sister, who could be difficult at times, and that's why she was in prison, would, as you mentioned earlier, have part of her remission lost if she reacted badly to the male that was in prison beside her. That was during the Dogotowski protest. And all of that just says to me that we've got a hell of a long way still to go in the context of equal rights for women. We don't have them. If we had equal rights, we wouldn't be sitting here. It wouldn't have happened. And, I suppose there were some women in 1979, I wasn't one of them, I was 16, 17, when Thatcher was elected, you thought, well, at least it's a woman, some things are going to change. And at the end of that, by God, how wrong could you be? We've just watched the same thing happen in Scotland. It's unbearable.
I just wanted to mention Audrey Nicholl,
because she's an ex-police officer with, of course, with her experience of setting up a sexual abuse centre in, actually I don't know the location, but potentially I would imagine this in the northeast. And it's just a reminder that we should all be watching the Justice Committee meeting that's coming up this week, that she is convener, which she mentioned to me in her latest email to me. Not that specific meeting, but how, you know, she's very involved, but, you know, we all know she voted for the GRR. So it's really just to remind people that, you know, they're obviously going to be discussing the Scottish Prisons decision, etc. So, yeah, we all really need to be all over this and not let up any of that pressure, because they're all yellow-bellied, you know, psychopaths that, you know, have lost all of our respect. So.
Yeah. I mean, I have absolutely zero respect for them. I mean, really, I couldn't be more. I mean, I suppose I despise them. It's probably the best way to go about it. It's not the ones that have been captured by the gender ideology. You know, like, if they've been captured by gender ideology, then, you know, they're stupid, etc. But it's the ones that know it's wrong, and they know it's harmful, and they know that women are going to suffer if this goes through. I mean, they are, and they know it, and they're still voting for it. That's the people I have, like, zero respect for. Zero. And I could never respect them again. I mean, Michelle Thompson stood in the Scottish Parliament and this is the thing that makes me angry about, is that women are having to relive their trauma. Every time this comes up, women that have been, and that's nearly all women, have been subject to sexual trauma, they have to relive it. And it's forcing people like Susan Dalgetty, like bravely, writing in the Scotsman, I think it was, of what happened to her. Michelle Thompson. And she stands up in Parliament and she tells them what happens to her. And she asks them, you know, don't let predators change their sex before trial. And they don't vote for them. They vote against her. That is how much a woman's word is worth in Scotland. You know, a woman's testimony. I mean, a man's wants will beat a woman's needs every time. Hollywood. It's not in Scotland, you're right. It's how much a woman's word is worth in Hollywood. Because obviously the Scottish people, thank goodness, are on our side.
See, on that note, in Cornton Vale, I think that it's likely that the area where Adam Graham was held was one of the special high security, secure areas, which is actually designed for the most vulnerable women. And these little units are obviously for people that might have a mental health difficulty or they might be pregnant, that kind of thing. So that man was using a specially equipped area earmarked for a vulnerable woman. And it wasn't as if he was in, you know, a normal cell. And the other thing I would say is that I've met a lot of women through my work who were in prison. Some of them I met in prison, some of them I met out of prison, who were there because, you mentioned the care system had let them down, or their families had let them down, or both. And very many of these women were traumatised as children, and, you know, they were sexually abused as children, and they went on to become prostitutes, and that's how they ended up in the jail. Some of them feeding a drug and alcohol habit, shoplifting, getting into violence, all that kind of thing. And to think that families and society had done that to women who, once they were locked up, were then going to be accommodated beside a male rapist and be basically told, keep your mouth shut, don't object to this. It's just, to me, it is the irresponsibility, lack of decency of the absolutely worst, unforgivable degree. Because the government have been warned over and over again, and they didn't give a damn. Didn't give a damn to their own jobs.
So I think we probably better wrap up because it's been like a couple of hours. And so I'll invite Yvonne to sum up.
Well, that was unexpected. But I think it's been a really fruitful discussion, and I think we're all probably on the same page, I keep going on about independence, and everything that we've discussed tonight goes back to independence, because I really believe that Scotland can become one of the most sensibly progressive countries in the world today. And I do a lot of travelling, and when people ask me where I'm from and I say Scotland, invariably there's a great big smile, because that is how the rest of the world looks upon Scotland. At the moment, some of those people are laughing at us because of the farce that's been unravelling in Hollywood. And one of the things that I will not forgive Nicola Sturgeon for over this whole GRR business is shining this spotlight onto Scotland, and then who bails us out? Westminster, the very group that we want to get away from and be free to run our own lives and make our own decisions. And that was shameful. But the GRR hasn't gone away. It's hanging like a flaming albatross overhead, and the sooner we shoot it down, the better. Thank you.
So, Eva?
That was definitely unexpected. The Women Wore Peace campaign obviously was cross-party, all-party, no-party. But I would like to think that there are now some women in Scotland who believe in independence, who found a political home in Alba, and who will continue to campaign not just for women's rights but for independence, so that we as women can shape the country that we want Scotland to be.
So that brings us to the end of this meeting. And one thing I would ask maybe is if we could have some influence at all on the debate moving forward. You know, write letters. There'll be hustings for these candidates for SNP leadership. So it might be worthwhile phoning up or having your questions ready. I mean, you know, like, is someone with a penis who rapes women a man or not? Those kinds of questions. So that could be a way of putting pressure on, because what we ideally want is for them not to challenge the GRR. So if you could get a candidate, maybe Ash Regan or Kate Forbes, possibly Kate Forbes, though she didn't actually vote, just ask them and try and get someone that isn't going to challenge. And then at least that, I mean, Eva's talking about all the extra stuff, and there's loads of stuff throughout Scottish service, all the public services in Scotland and third sector. But at least that would be, by the 17th of April, that particular danger of that bill might be gone. We don't know. I have no idea what they're going to do for the hustings.
Well, is that restricted? I don't know.
I mean, like, there's going to be things where they, you know, possibly like phone-ins and things like that. There'll be things where you can potentially, members of the public can ask them questions. Oh, you could, yeah. Yeah. You could email the candidates and maybe they would reply to you with your questions, you never know. But if there's any way of putting pressure, you know, to get a candidate that's more women-friendly, that would be great. But it's not our decision, obviously. Bye then.